At its height, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land and ruled over hundreds of millions of people. From the frozen forests of Canada to the deserts of Africa, from the ports of India to the islands of the Pacific, British power reached across every ocean. It was the largest empire in history, and yet it began on a small, rainy island at the edge of Europe. That is the first mystery. How did a country smaller than many of the lands it conquered build a global system so vast that the sun seemed never to set on it? The answer was not one battle. It was not one king. And it was not one brilliant plan. The British Empire grew through trade, war, piracy, slavery, naval power, financial ambition, industrial technology, and a relentless ability to turn local rivalries into imperial advantage. But there was another side to that power. For every map painted red, there were societies disrupted. For every fortune made in London, Liverpool, or Glasgow, there were workers, soldiers, farmers, and families somewhere else paying the price. The empire created railways, ports, legal systems, and global trade networks. It also created famines, forced labor, violent conquest, racial hierarchies, and borders that would outlive the empire itself. This is not only the story of how Britain ruled the world. It is the story of how that rule was built, challenged, and finally broken. And the most important part is this. The British Empire did not collapse because Britain suddenly became weak. It collapsed because the people living under it refused to remain subjects forever. But to understand the fall, we must begin long before Britain was an empire. In the late Middle Ages, England was not a global superpower. It was a kingdom shaped by war with France, conflict among its nobles, and uncertainty at home. Spain and Portugal were already sailing across oceans, conquering territories, and building trade routes that brought silver, spices, and wealth back to Europe. Portuguese sailors pushed around Africa toward Asia. Spanish conquistadors destroyed powerful states in the Americas. Gold and silver crossed the Atlantic in enormous quantities. England watched from the sidelines. It wanted to share, but wanting an empire and building one were two very different things. England lacked the resources of Spain. It could not simply imitate Spanish conquest on the same scale. So English expansion began in a rougher, more improvised way. Merchants sought new markets. Sailors searched for passages. Private investors financed dangerous voyages. And men who were called pirates by Spain were often called heroes in England. One of the most famous was Francis Drake. Drake attacked Spanish ships and settlements, seized treasure, and sailed around the world. To Spain, he was a criminal. To Queen Elizabeth I, he was useful. He brought wealth, prestige, and a message. England might be weaker than Spain, but it could still strike at Spain's empire. Then, in 1588, Spain sent a massive fleet to invade England. The Spanish Armada was one of the greatest military threats England had ever faced. Its defeat became a defining moment in English history. Weather, tactical decisions, English naval attacks, and Spanish difficulties all played a role. But the result was clear. Spain had failed to conquer England. The victory did not instantly create the British Empire, but it gave England confidence. It also strengthened the belief that naval power could protect the kingdom and open the way to expansion. The sea would become Britain's greatest weapon. In the early 1600s, English settlers began establishing permanent colonies in North America. Jamestown was founded in Virginia in 1607. At first, the settlement nearly collapsed. Disease, hunger, poor planning, and conflict with indigenous peoples brought it close to destruction. But tobacco changed everything. Europe wanted it. Virginia could grow it. Soon, tobacco plantations spread across the colony, and with them came an increasing dependence on forced labor. In 1619, a group of captive Africans arrived in Virginia. Over time, English colonial law hardened slavery into a racial and hereditary system. That system would become one of the foundations of Britain's Atlantic Empire. In the Caribbean, the pattern became even more brutal. Islands such as Barbados and Jamaica were transformed into plantation economies. Sugar produced enormous profits, but sugar required land, labor, and violence. Indigenous populations had already been devastated by disease and conquest. European planters imported enslaved Africans in vast numbers. People were kidnapped, transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, sold, and forced to work under deadly regimes. The wealth generated by slavery flowed through British ports, banks, insurance companies, shipyards, and merchant houses. Cities grew richer, families built fortunes, and the empire expanded. This was one of the central truths of early British power. The empire was not built only by soldiers. It was built by accountants, investors, shipowners, plantation managers, and companies. One of the most important of those companies was the East India Company. Founded in 1600, it began as a trading enterprise. Its goal was to buy and sell goods from Asia. Spices, textiles, tea, porcelain, and other valuable products could generate extraordinary profits. At first, the company depended on the permission of powerful Asian rulers. India was not weak. The Mughal Empire was one of the richest and most sophisticated states in the world. European traders operated at the edges of a far larger system. But the political balance would not remain stable forever. As Mughal power weakened in the 18th century, regional rivalries grew. The East India Company adapted. It stopped behaving like a normal business. It recruited armies. It made alliances. It fought wars. It collected taxes. And it began taking territory. This transformation reached a dramatic point in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. The company's forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal with the help of local allies and betrayal inside the Nawab's camp. The battle itself was not enormous, but its consequences were. Bengal was one of the richest regions in the world. Control over its revenues gave the company money to finance more soldiers, more wars, and more expansion. A trading corporation had begun turning into a territorial power. It was one of the strangest events in modern history. A private company, backed by a distant state, was building an empire of its own. But Britain's rise was never smooth. In North America, 13 colonies had grown prosperous and increasingly confident. After Britain defeated France in the 7 Years' War, the British government tried to make the colonies help pay the cost of imperial defense. Taxes and new regulations followed. Colonists protested that they were being taxed without proper representation. Tensions escalated. In 1775, war began. The American Revolution became a serious blow to British power. The 13 colonies declared independence. With crucial support from France and other European rivals of Britain, they defeated British forces. In 1783, Britain recognized the United States. The loss was humiliating. Some believed the British Empire might be finished. Instead, Britain changed direction. It expanded elsewhere. Canada remained under British control. Settlement increased in Australia. India became even more important. And Britain's commercial and naval power continued to grow. This was another reason the empire lasted so long. It could survive defeat by shifting its attention. When one door closed, it searched for another. The wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France then transformed Britain into the dominant global naval power. For more than 2 decades, Europe was shaken by war. Napoleon conquered or controlled much of the continent. Britain resisted him through coalitions, money, trade, and above all, the Royal Navy. In 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleet. Nelson was killed in the battle, but his victory secured British command of the seas. Napoleon could dominate land in Europe. He could not easily break Britain's maritime network. British ships moved troops, protected trade, attacked colonies, and connected distant territories. By the time Napoleon was defeated in 1815, Britain stood in an extraordinary position. Its greatest European rival was broken. Its navy had no equal. Its merchants traded around the globe. Its financial system was powerful, and the Industrial Revolution was accelerating. Factories transformed production. Steam power increased speed. Coal fueled machines. British textiles flooded markets. Iron, ships, weapons, and later railways gave Britain advantages that earlier empires had never possessed. The empire was no longer simply expanding with sails and muskets. It was entering the age of industry. Yet this was also the period when Britain began confronting one of the darkest foundations of its own wealth. The campaign against the slave trade grew stronger. Enslaved people had resisted slavery from the beginning through rebellion, escape, sabotage, and survival. At the same time, abolitionists in Britain organized petitions, published evidence, and pushed Parliament to act. In 1807, Britain banned the transatlantic slave trade within its empire. In 1833, slavery itself was abolished across most of the British Empire. But abolition did not mean justice. The British government compensated slave owners for the loss of what it treated as property. The formerly enslaved received no equivalent compensation. In some colonies, systems of apprenticeship and labor control continued exploitation. Still, abolition was a major transformation. The Royal Navy began intercepting slave ships. Britain increasingly presented itself as an opponent of slavery. But the empire did not stop depending on unequal labor. It simply used new forms. Indentured laborers from India and elsewhere were sent to plantations across the empire. Many signed contracts they barely understood. Conditions could be harsh, wages low, and freedom limited. The language changed. The structure of control often remained. By the middle of the 19th century, India had become the center of Britain's imperial system. The East India Company ruled enormous territories. British officials described their rule as order, reform, and modernization. They introduced new laws. They expanded taxation. They built roads and communication networks. They promoted some social reforms. But company rule also disrupted local economies, weakened traditional systems, and directed Indian wealth toward British interests. Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, formed much of the company's military power. Without them, British control would have been impossible. Then, in 1857, the system exploded. The immediate spark involved rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindu and Muslim soldiers, this was deeply offensive. But the rebellion had much deeper causes. There was anger over annexations, fear of religious interference, resentment against pay and conditions, discontent among princes, soldiers, peasants, and communities affected by British policies. The uprising spread across northern and central India. British civilians were killed. Indian civilians were also massacred. Cities became battlegrounds. Sieges, executions, reprisals, and atrocities followed. The violence was enormous. The rebellion was eventually crushed. But the East India Company never recovered. In 1858, the British government took direct control of India. Queen Victoria later became Empress of India. The British Raj had begun. After 1857, British rule became more cautious in some areas and more racially rigid in others. Officials often avoided direct interference in religion. They relied more heavily on princes and local elites. But racial separation intensified. British clubs, neighborhoods, schools, and institutions reinforced a sense of superiority. India was treated as the crown jewel of the empire. It provided soldiers, taxes, raw materials, markets, and prestige. But it was never simply passive. Resistance continued in political, social, and cultural forms. The seeds of independence were already growing. Meanwhile, the empire expanded across the world. Canada moved towards self-government within the empire. Australia developed as a settler colony after beginning as a destination for transported prisoners. New Zealand was colonized through treaties, conflict, and settlement. In all these places, indigenous peoples suffered land loss, disease, warfare, forced assimilation, and legal discrimination. British settlers often described empty spaces waiting for development. But those lands were not empty. They were already home to peoples with their own political systems, cultures, and histories. Empire depended on making those people less visible. In Ireland, British rule produced another long history of conflict. Ireland had been conquered and colonized over centuries. Land ownership, religion, and political power were deeply unequal. In the 1840s, potato blight destroyed the crop on which millions depended. The Great Famine followed. Around 1 million people died. Even more emigrated. Food continued to leave Ireland while people starved. British policies did not create the blight, but the government's response was shaped by ideology, indifference, and a refusal to fully interrupt market systems. The famine transformed Ireland. It deepened anger against British rule, and it sent Irish communities across the Atlantic where memories of suffering would survive for generations. By the late 19th century, Britain's empire seemed more powerful than ever. Queen Victoria became the symbol of the age. London stood at the center of global finance. British ships carried goods across the oceans. Telegraph cables connected distant colonies. Railways pushed inland. The map appeared to glow red with British possessions. But the empire's expansion now entered a more aggressive phase. European powers competed for territory in Africa. This became known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain seized or expanded control in Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, South Africa, and other regions. The reasons varied. Some territories offered resources. Others protected trade routes. Egypt was especially important because of the Suez Canal. The canal connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, shortening the route to India. Control of Suez became essential to British strategy. But imperial expansion in Africa was not simply a story of Europeans arriving and winning easily. African states resisted. Some defeated European forces in major battles. Others fought long campaigns. Britain suffered one of its most shocking defeats in 1879 at Isinalwana, where Zulu forces destroyed a British column in southern Africa. The defeat stunned the empire. A modern European army had been overwhelmed. Britain eventually defeated the Zulu kingdom, but the battle revealed something imperial propaganda often concealed. Conquest was never automatic. It had to be fought for, and it could fail. In Sudan, British and Egyptian forces faced the Mahdist state. In West Africa, British expansion brought war against kingdoms and communities resisting foreign control. In Kenya, land was taken for European settlement. In southern Africa, rivalry over territory, gold, and political power produced conflict with the Boer republics. The Second Boer War began in 1899. At first, Britain expected victory. Instead, the war became longer and more difficult. Boer commandos used mobile guerrilla tactics. The British responded with a scorched earth campaign. Farms were destroyed. Civilians were forced into concentration camps. Tens of thousands died, many of them women and children. Black Africans were also placed in camps and suffered greatly, though their experiences were often ignored. The war exposed the cost of imperial control. Britain won, but victory damaged its moral reputation and revealed weaknesses in its army. The empire was huge. It was also increasingly difficult to defend. At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain still looked dominant. But new powers were rising. Germany was building industry and a navy. The United States had become an economic giant. Japan had modernized rapidly. The age of easy British supremacy was ending. Then came the First World War. In 1914, Britain entered the conflict after Germany invaded Belgium. The war was European in origin, but the empire made it global. Troops came from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Africa, and the Caribbean. They fought in France, the Middle East, Africa, Gallipoli, and other fronts. More than 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas. Colonial laborers supported armies. Resources from across the empire fed the war machine. The war demonstrated the empire's strength. It also exposed its contradiction. Britain claimed to be fighting for freedom and civilization. Yet millions of people under British rule had no political freedom of their own. After the war, Britain gained even more territory through mandates taken from the defeated German and Ottoman empires. On a map, the empire had never been larger. But beneath the surface, it was exhausted. Britain was deeply in debt. A generation had been scarred by war. Colonial soldiers returned home with new expectations. Nationalist movements grew stronger. In India, hopes for greater self-government were met with repression. In 1919, British troops under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer fired on an unarmed crowd at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar. Hundreds were killed. The massacre shocked India. For many, it destroyed the belief that British rule could be reformed peacefully from within. One of the leaders who transformed Indian resistance was Mohandas Gandhi. He had developed methods of nonviolent protest in South Africa, where he had experienced racial discrimination. In India, he built mass movements around civil disobedience, boycotts, marches, and refusal to cooperate with unjust authority. Gandhi did not act alone. India's independence movement included many leaders, organizations, workers, students, revolutionaries, women, religious groups, and political traditions. Some supported nonviolence. Others believed armed struggle was necessary. Some wanted a united India. Others feared domination by rival communities. But the basic demand became increasingly difficult to ignore. India should rule itself. Across the empire, similar pressures were growing. Irish nationalists launched a rebellion in Dublin in 1916. The Easter Rising was defeated, and its leaders were executed. But the executions changed public opinion. A war of independence followed. In 1921, most of Ireland left the United Kingdom as the Irish Free State. Northern Ireland remained within the United Kingdom. Partition created a division that would shape later conflict. The loss of most of Ireland was another warning. The empire was not held together only by flags and law. It depended on consent, cooperation, and fear. When those weakened, control became expensive. The Great Depression made the situation worse. Global trade fell. Unemployment rose. Colonial economies suffered. Then, in 1939, Europe went to war again. The Second World War became the final turning point. Britain stood against Nazi Germany after the fall of France. For a time, Britain and its empire fought on while much of Europe was under Axis control. Colonial troops again served in vast numbers. India contributed soldiers, money, and resources. African soldiers fought in multiple theaters. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand mobilized. The empire helped Britain survive. But the war drained Britain financially and militarily. The United States became the dominant Western power. The Soviet Union emerged as another superpower. Japan's rapid victories in Asia shattered the myth of European invincibility. In 1942, Singapore fell to Japan. British commanders had called it an impregnable fortress. Its surrender was a disaster. Tens of thousands of troops were taken prisoner. Across Asia, people saw that the British could be defeated. The psychological effect was enormous. At the same time, wartime policy caused terrible suffering in India. In 1943, famine devastated Bengal. Millions died. The causes were complex and included crop problems, wartime disruption, inflation, and failures of distribution. But British policy and Churchill's wartime government have been heavily criticized for worsening the disaster and failing to respond adequately. While the empire fought in the name of freedom, people under British rule starved. By 1945, the contradiction could no longer be hidden. Britain had helped defeat fascism, but it could not easily justify denying independence to others. The empire had won the war. It had also lost the future. India became independent in 1947, but freedom came with partition. British India was divided into India and Pakistan. The process was rushed. Borders were drawn with limited time and incomplete knowledge. Millions of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs found themselves on the wrong side of new frontiers. Communal violence exploded. Entire populations moved. Trains arrived filled with bodies. Families disappeared. Perhaps more than 1 million people died, though estimates vary. Around 15 million were displaced. The end of British rule in India was one of the most important events of the 20th century. It was also one of the bloodiest. Britain left, but the consequences of imperial decisions remained. After India, the empire unraveled rapidly. Burma and Ceylon became independent. Across Africa, nationalist movements demanded self-rule. Britain sometimes negotiated, sometimes it delayed, and sometimes it answered resistance with violence. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising was met with detention camps, forced resettlement, torture, and abuse. For decades, the official story minimized what happened. Later evidence and legal cases exposed the scale of brutality. In Malaya, British forces fought a communist insurgency. In Cyprus, armed resistance challenged colonial rule. In Palestine, Britain faced conflict between Arab and Jewish communities, competing promises, and violence that its mandate could not resolve. The imperial map was collapsing. Then came the Suez Crisis of 1956. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France secretly coordinated with Israel to retake control. The invasion began. Militarily, Britain and France still had power. Politically, they no longer controlled the world. The United States opposed the operation. Financial pressure forced Britain to withdraw. Suez became a symbol. The age when Britain could act as an independent global empire was over. The empire continued shrinking. Ghana became independent in 1957. Nigeria followed in 1960. Kenya in 1963. Other territories across Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and the Pacific gained independence. Some transitions were peaceful. Others were violent. Some new states inherited functioning institutions. Others inherited borders that forced rival groups into fragile political systems. In many places, colonial economies had been designed to export a small number of raw materials rather than support balanced development. Independence brought sovereignty. It did not erase the structure left behind. The British Empire did not disappear in a single moment. It faded through treaties, rebellions, elections, wars, and withdrawals. Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. For many, that ceremony marked the symbolic end of the empire. But empire does not vanish simply because flags are lowered. Its legacy remains in language, law, education, trade, migration, military alliances, and borders. English became a global language partly because of British expansion. Parliamentary systems spread across former colonies. Railways, civil services, and courts often survived. The Commonwealth created a voluntary association among many former imperial territories. Supporters of the empire sometimes point to these institutions as evidence of progress. But infrastructure was usually built to serve imperial priorities. Railways often moved troops and resources. Legal systems protected colonial authority. Education could produce local administrators while also teaching the superiority of British culture. The same institution could bring opportunity and control at the same time. That is why the legacy of the British Empire remains so contested. It cannot be reduced to a simple story of heroes or villains. It created connections across continents. It also created suffering on a vast scale. It fought slavery after profiting from it. It spoke of law while ruling without democratic consent. It celebrated freedom while suppressing resistance. It built institutions while extracting wealth. And it often convinced itself that domination was a gift. The question is not whether every British official was cruel. Many believed they were serving a larger purpose. Some opposed abuses. Some supported reform. Some genuinely tried to improve the lives of the people they governed. But empires are not judged only by personal intentions. They must be judged by systems. Who held power? Who made decisions? Who benefited? Who paid? The British Empire survived because it rarely ruled alone. It worked through local princes, landlords, soldiers, merchants, interpreters, clerks, and political elites. It used division when unity threatened control. It offered privilege to some groups and punishment to others. It adapted to local conditions. That flexibility made it powerful. It also made its legacy complicated. In one colony, Britain might rule directly. In another, it governed through a king. In one place, settlers took land. In another, companies controlled trade. In one region, the empire depended on the navy. In another, it depended on local troops. There was no single British Empire. There were many imperial systems connected by money, force, shipping, and belief. And belief mattered. Many British people were taught that empire represented civilization, Christianity, order, and progress. Exhibitions displayed colonized peoples and objects as proof of imperial reach. School maps painted territories red. Newspapers celebrated victories. Adventure stories turned conquest into romance. This culture helped make empire feel normal. But for those living under British rule, the experience could look completely different. A farmer might know empire as a tax collector. A soldier might know it as a commanding officer. A family might know it as land taken for settlement. A worker might know it as a plantation, mine, or railway. A prisoner might know it as a camp. A student might know it as a language that opened doors while pushing aside their own. The empire was global. Its effects were personal. So how did a small island rule a quarter of the world? It used the sea. It built the world's most powerful navy. It created banks, companies, and financial networks capable of sustaining war. It industrialized before its rivals. It exploited divisions among competitors. It recruited armies from the very societies it controlled. It adapted after defeat. It presented conquest as law and profit as progress. And it convinced millions that its power was permanent. But it was not permanent. No empire is. The same global connections that strengthened British rule also spread ideas of nationalism, rights, and self-government. Colonial soldiers saw the world. Students learned the language of freedom. Workers organized. Newspapers connected movements. Leaders turned imperial promises against the empire itself. Britain said it stood for liberty. Its subjects demanded liberty too. Britain taught parliamentary government. Its colonies demanded representation. Britain fought wars against tyranny. Its colonies asked why foreign rule should continue. In the end, The empire was defeated not by one enemy, but by its own contradictions. It could not rule a quarter of the world forever while claiming to defend freedom. It could not demand loyalty without granting equality. It could not extract wealth without creating resistance. And it could not survive 2 world wars without exhausting the power that held it together. The British Empire changed the world. Modern borders, conflicts, languages, institutions, and migration patterns still carry its imprint. Its story is not finished because its consequences are still alive. In London, Delhi, Kingston, Lagos, Dublin, Nairobi, Sydney, Cairo, and countless other cities, the past remains part of the present. The empire once claimed that the sun never set on British territory. But that phrase concealed a deeper truth. The sun did not set because the empire stretched across the globe. And wherever it rose, someone was waking beneath a system they had not chosen. History remembers the ships, the queens, the soldiers, and the red maps. But the real story is larger. It belongs to the enslaved people who resisted, the soldiers who fought for a crown that did not treat them as equals, the families who survived famine, the communities that lost land, the leaders who organized independence, and the millions who lived ordinary lives beneath extraordinary power. Britain ruled a quarter of the world, but it never fully controlled the hopes of the people within it. And that is why the largest empire in history eventually became a collection of independent nations. Not because the empire simply gave freedom away, but because people across the world demanded that history belong to them.